in a recent article you've had in The Economist, you're talking about, in what is called UN 80. We're coming to the, UN General Assembly very soon. At the time of this recording, there is a need to reform, and it's because of money, lack of money, the cuts to the budget and others, but also it's because of what people say, lack of efficiency or bloating or so on. You had a very particular point of how should it go forward. Can you elaborate that?
The main purpose of the UN when it was founded was to prevent another great war. And it was at a time when, 80 million people had been killed in the Second World War, and when the first atomic bombs were about to be exploded. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that threat is still there, that we could have another great war, that we could have a nuclear war. And I think the UN is the only universal body dedicated to peace that we have. We should make sure that we're making it the best possible instrument for war prevention, as well as for terminating wars as well. So I think there's a peacemaking role of the UN that really should be front and center of thinking about what the UN should be in the future. I think we can think about the Security Council in terms of its membership. The permanent membership is very dated, as pretty much everyone would agree. But the Security Council has never really worked as it was meant to work. It's almost never been an enforcement body. It's possible to pass resolutions and countries to ignore it. So it's not clear to me that even if we had better membership, that would automatically help in terms of ending war or even preventing it. I think in that political space, again, it's been successive secretaries general, some more than others, who've really filled that peacemaking space, unintended by the charter. So I think that's something that we have to think about, especially when we think about who could be or who should be secretary general next year when a new one is going to be selected. I think, as you're right, I mean, there are so many other parts of the UN system, so many other UN bureaucracies. The only thing I would say to that is, obviously, there are many areas where the UN is really indispensable, does a lot of great work. There are a lot of amazing people who work in the UN. There's also, I'm sure, a lot of waste and inefficiency in different parts of the system as well. But I think that in the 1990s and 2000s, not necessarily in a conspiratorial way, but maybe through a lot of good faith efforts, the UN kind of started to take, I think, a turn that's been negative in some ways, which is that rather than being funded by the main budget, it's been funded by voluntary contributions, which means more and more of the UN is funded by a few Western governments. And again, people in those governments may have intended the best things in terms of wanting simply to give more aid or more assistance or help with a peacekeeping operation. But it changed the nature of the UN system and those parts of the UN system that then grew. And so a lot of the UN system became more of a donor delivery mechanism than the kind of genuine multilateral organization that was intended and that existed before. So I think when we think about reform, maybe that's not a good word. I mean, people have thought about UN reform since 1946, probably. So there have been so many different efforts and ideas. But when you think about the future of the UN, I think that part of it, the donor delivery mechanism, is in some ways the least important because maybe others can do it. Donors can give money through other organizations. I think the two most important parts that we need to think about and preserve is the UN as that global forum where all of the world has a voice in some way. That's one, and sets norms and promotes agendas. And second is that role of the Secretary General as a peacemaker, supported if possible by a more broad-based and more legitimate UN Security Council.
It seems we're doing multilateral diplomacy in a 20th century way still. And I mean, that goes from how we think about it all the way to the way the resolutions are written, the way they, the archaic language and process, the trying to make things absolutely precise and then making them vague and washed down. There's a lot of that. And we are in a time now where that isn't really feasible. We can't we can't do that. So what can we do? What does a multilateral diplomacy look like that actually addresses the problems and concerns of our time? And here I'm talking from, AI to misinformation and disinformation, to the dismantling of international law, to the, scary as hell apparent descent into far right and potentially worse in many liberal countries. What sort of diplomacy? How does it look like?
I think some of these issues are also issues, whether it's about extremism in different countries that really have to be thought about and managed and addressed at a local level, not just even at a national level, but at a local level as well. I think when we get to the global sort of international stage, I think there's a danger of things becoming too complicated that even if they're sort of semi-successful, it becomes so detached and so far away from the ordinary person that especially in some countries, people just feel these are elites that are deciding things in conferences very, very far away. I think there must be different ways in which people can get together, different governments can get together, whether it's on the challenge of AI, whether it's on climate change, pandemic. The UN could be part of the framing, and it has been at times, but I don't think the UN has to be the answer to everything. And I think we should be open to different combinations, different ways of trying to work, whether it's government, civil society, others, and tackling this whole range of issues. I think to put everything on the UN and to say, how is the UN going to solve A, B, C, D all the way down, I think that's a disaster for the UN. And I think a UN that tries to be everything to everyone is almost bound to fail.
Recently, I was reading a book by Mahmoud Mamdani called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, and part of it is he's saying the two of the major problems we're facing now, terrorism and the drug proliferation, are in many ways a direct result of the US, the CIA having done like Laos, then Angola, Tanzania, Guatemala, and then finally capitalizing in Afghanistan. There has always been a Cold War and proxy wars and intelligence operations and so on. And the CIA is only one of them, and they have used drugs and drug smuggling and supporting drug lords as part of pushing for an anti-Soviet action in many countries. How can a UN function when they are, I mean, you said there's no enforcement mechanism, there's no police, there's no ability to force countries to do so. And countries seem, or, at least powerful countries seem to choose to do things that are significantly unproductive and sometimes quite destructive. How is it expected, or when was it successful for the UN to function within this sort of almost lawless world?
In 1945, there was never a decision to create a world government. There was, even the most idealistic, planners who might have wanted a world government in 1945, Americans, others, didn't think that publics, politicians, governments were ready for anything like that. And so, at the center of the UN's DNA is still this idea that the big powers are going to hold sway and that whatever happens, they themselves will not be directly challenged by the UN. And this is why they have their votes, their vetoes in the Security Council. They may be challenged in some ways by General Assembly decisions and other things, but when it comes to enforcement, it's not an organization that's going to take on any of the nuclear armed countries then and now. So we shouldn't be thinking along those lines. I mean, if we want to move towards world government, that's a different kind of track. That's a different kind of campaign. That's a different kind of struggle. That's different from the UN that we actually have and what it's actually meant, or what it's actually been able to do over these past 60, 70 years. And again, a lot of that in the political space, I mean, leaving aside all the development issues and humanitarian assistance and everything else, in the political space, it's meant a largely deadlocked Security Council, but it has meant at the best of times a Secretary General who's had the weight and prestige and shrewdness to know how to build up his political capital, to mediate and deal with and manage smaller conflicts, and then to use that sometimes to be able to put pressure even on the bigger countries, and at the right time even to stand up to those bigger countries as well. So I think there's no easy answer. But I think the Secretary Generals who've been successful have had this balance, but it's always meant understanding what the UN is and isn't, but actually trying to push the margins as much as possible in terms of the political role and space that the Secretary General has. Often that means risk-taking. It means sometimes taking on the big powers, but it cannot only mean taking on the big powers all the time.
And then you mentioned also that the West has turned away from the UN in the 70s. What happened after?
I mean, I guess you can read it, and I'll be really interested to know, when people read the book, what they think. I mean, you can read it in two ways. I mean, one way is to read it as by the late 60s, because of Vietnam, because of the positions that he took increasingly on Vietnam and became a real thorn in the side of the Lyndon Johnson administration first, and then to an extent with the Nixon administration after. The Americans went from thinking that the UN was an instrument they could use as they wanted to something that could be a real problem for them. And even the Secretary Generalship could be something that could cause them political problems at home, because he was very popular in America for a time. He was voted the sixth, I think, most popular man in the country, according to a Gallup poll. So the Americans increasingly marginalized the UN, especially under Nixon and Kissinger by the early 70s. And then you had this ideological backlash within the US with Reagan, with others who came in by the late 70s, who saw the UN principally as a hotbed of third world radicalism, and something that the US should try at least to manage, if not to kind of move away from as much as possible. So in that way, it's quite a tragic story, but that's an American perspective. That's a Washington perspective. I think from the perspective of the rest of the world, I mean, their principal goal of creating an international system in which the whole world decolonized could be a part, that was a success. And it was a success that their issues and ideas became integral to the first world body that humanity has ever known. And then it depends a little bit on, how one sees the past 50 years. That yes, we've had many wars and everything, but we've also had this unparalleled period of peace and prosperity in many parts of the world. And I think some of that is not because of the UN specifically in terms of bureaucracies and everything. But it's part of this international system that was cemented together as much by these newly decolonized countries as by the original founders in 1945.
Usually we close up by asking what actionable things can people who listen to us, people who are in policy making or in the humanitarian sector, or even lay persons who are interested, what can they do? And I have one for now. I would encourage people to read your book, Peacemaker, about U Thant and the Forgotten Quest for a Just World. It is a really good read, and it reveals a lot of what you wouldn't get from the generalized histories, and it teaches us a few lessons that we need today.
For the UN, when it was at its height and most dynamic, it was really important to have those non-aligned states, those other neutral states like Ireland and Sweden, really pushing for it. It was really important that it was still this time when the Americans still felt invested and couldn't just ignore what the UN was doing. But it was also really important that there were civil society movements, publics on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world who looked towards the UN for leadership to do its job. And I think that's what needs to be revived, that spirit of internationalism, this sense that we do have to work across borders in all of these things. I think that's waning. And I think when we think about internationalism, when we think about what civil society, ordinary people can focus on, yes, there are many issues, whether it's climate, whether it's AI, whether it's protecting human rights in different countries around the world. But I would say, number one, don't forget about peace. And for people to live in a war is probably the worst possible thing. And I think we should be really, really fearful that we don't sleepwalk back into another great war and a nuclear catastrophe. And, when you think about the UN, when you discuss the UN, to really put that front and center, how are we going to prevent another world war? What is the role that the UN can play, and how can civil society help in making sure that government leaders, political leaders also help in moving in that direction and choosing the right Secretary General next time around as well.